Hello, everybody, and welcome to the ASU Masterclass. I'm Emilia Gracia, your host for today. It's great to have so many participants here. We'll be conducting the session in English, but if you prefer Spanish, click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. The goal of the ASU Masterclass is to bring researchers and professors from Arizona State University to talk to you no matter where you live. Today's topic looks at how we can use generative AI beneficially and what pitfalls to be aware of. A sincere thank you to Santana Education for their sponsorship of these lectures and to La Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara for providing Spanish translation. Our presenter, Jake Penholster, will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. This lecture is being recorded and will be available to your professors later. Now, let's welcome Professor Penholster, the Executive Dean and Professors at ASU's Herberger Institute for Design Arts. Professor Penholster, the rest of the time is yours.
Great. Thank you, Amelia. Much appreciated. Thank you for having me today. It's such a pleasure to see such a great attendance. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So as Amelia said, in addition to, I'm an executive dean at the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts. I'm also the founding director of the Media and Immersive Experience Center at ASU, the MIX Center. And our specialty is in understanding the intersection of the physical and the digital and human experience, and essentially understanding new and emerging media technologies. And my background has been primarily in creating interactive and immersive experiences for humans in live space, as well as VR, and also media installations across the world. And I'm delighted to be talking with you today about the Practitioner's Guide to Generative AI. For those of you unfamiliar with generative AI, at least on a functional level, I wanted to remind and sort of level set for everyone that this field, which has taken up so much of our public consciousness these days, is only 604 days old. 604 days ago, as of today, Wednesday, was when Stable Diffusion was released. This is really the first truly text to image prompt generator that was released to the public, and the first instance of really being able to create images from scratch using nothing but your imagination and a few words. And that is, and since then, we've seen an explosion of innovation in this field that has gone from simple images that were easy to identify as AI back in 604 days ago, now to full-length video at high resolution that is indistinguishable from reality. So that's just 604 days of progress. So the caveat in everything I'll say today is next week it could all change. This is to give you a chance to catch up to where we're at right now and to project forward a little bit, but there will be a lot of change in this field pretty much from here on out. We will see some very weird things to come. But first, if we have the poll ready, I want to get a level set of where everybody in the room is and just get a sense of how many people here have any experience with these Gen AI tools. Amelia, are you able to go to the first poll? Do I need to stop share?
Yes.
So the first poll, thank you. The first poll question: how would you rate your overall familiarity with image generative AI tools like DALL-E, Midjourney, Sora, etc.? Never heard of them but know very little, know some about them but never used them a little, or expert user? Please go ahead and respond to the polls on your screen. And Amelia, I can't see the results, so are you able to share those once we reach about, say, 300 or so responses? Or you're muted.
Yes, I should be able to.
Thank you. Okay. Wherever we're at in the sample now, let's.
426 responses.
Great.
Yes, would you like me to share them with everyone?
That would be great. I appreciate that.
Fantastic. So the majority says never heard of them, and that is about 33% of the respondents. 21% comment heard of them but know very little. 18% say know some about them but never use them, and 23% use them a little. 4% expert user.
Got it. Okay, that's kind of where I was assuming we would be. Thank you for that. The next, going back to. Great. And then for the next question I'd like to bring up is interest areas. So I want to understand better who, like in terms of focusing the rest of my time, where are people interested? What are people interested in learning more about? I'll stop share again.
Okay. Let me go. All right. Here we go.
So the question is, what are you most interested in about this topic? Learning to use the tools for my own creative work, better understanding of social impact and ethical issues, questions of intellectual property related to artificial intelligence, or just general awareness. You're curious and you want to learn more. Great, we'll give it about another 10 seconds. Great, Amelia, can you go ahead and share our results? Oh, you're muted.
All right. So might be able to see this here.
Yes, I can see.
Fantastic.
That's great. Learning to use my tools for my own creative work. That's excellent. This is where we want to be. I'm really glad to hear we've got the right audience at the right level for where we're going forward. So I'm excited to share the rest of this with you all. Okay, let's get into it for real and for true now. Okay. So just to give us some background, AI gets talked about a lot in the news, and generally speaking, we conflate a bunch of different things that aren't really the same to create a kind of overall presence of AI, which connects everything from ChatGPT to Skynet and the kind of Terminator into the world type scenarios. And so I wanted to just briefly outline and to stress, I am not a computer scientist. I am a maker of graphics. But just to give some basic definitions, one of the most familiar types of AI that we encounter in our daily lives is weak or narrow AI. This is generally associated with natural language processing, and the most common examples we see of it in our daily lives are Siri, Alexa, Hey Google, etc. Things where we're interacting with a model that has some training in the way human beings create language. In other words, which is what's referred to by natural language processing, but it isn't really thinking. It's just responding to certain scenarios built on a decision tree. What's out there in our minds is kind of the association with artificial intelligence most commonly, especially for people who have less knowledge about it, is what computer scientists would refer to as strong or general AI, which has not been achieved so far, we think. So far, we've never, and strong or general AI is what's, we normally use the kind of benchmark of consciousness. If this is like referring to AI that has truly achieved consciousness, and there's all sorts of nightmare scenarios associated with it. But most likely what will happen is we'll see it happen sometime over the next few years, and generalized consciousness will not actually have any significant effects immediately because the consciousness will evolve over time. And so I actually urge you not to have sort of apocalyptic viewpoints about strong or general AI, and it may have already occurred, and we would know nothing about it. However, the thing we're really here to talk about today is machine learning or specialized AI, which is what all Gen AI fits under. That includes large language models like ChatGPT and what we call diffusion models, which include all the things you'll see in the rest of this presentation. Now, diffusion and large language models are not really thinking, and they're not programmed in a neural network or to have a really conscious thought process. What they are is massive pattern recognition engines. They are essentially given a huge volume of language or images to train on, and then asked to be able to sort of recognize certain patterns associated between text and image or text and text, and then to recreate that text or that image in kind of a lowest common denominator model, like where it's saying, I am asked to create an image of a dog. I look at all the images of the dog on the internet, of dogs on the internet, and then I create a kind of average dog, and then some specificity can be added to that. But that's essentially what's going on, and it's creates quite sophisticated results. In ChatGPT's case, in large language models, we've already seen just in the 2 years it's been since ChatGPT 1 was released, and we're now in ChatGPT 4. We've seen disruption of academic traditions and protocols. We've seen disruption of creative industries, particularly around the generation of text or copy for creative work, for the writing of even short creative works and self-publishing. We've seen concerns about reliability, which I'll talk more about in a minute, and some concerns about long-term intellectual property, which I'll talk about at the end of this presentation. Just about reliability, for those of you who are using ChatGPT in your daily environment, some caution about when and how to deploy it and how to double check it. This is just an example. This is from about a year and a half ago, so the model has probably improved some in terms of reliability, but this is a gentleman named Noble Ackerson, who was a tech entrepreneur and innovator, asked ChatGPT who he himself was, and almost all of it was wrong, including, and my favorite is that it actually indicated that he had passed away in 2019. So just to know, like everything ChatGPT spits out sounds authoritative and certain, and a lot of times it's built off of bad interpretation of existing data. Beyond that, though, mostly what we're going to talk about today is what we call visual or image-based generative AI. And this has also had massive impacts, but it's been much less visible to kind of the daily news. It has major impacts on creative field, severe concerns about intellectual property, again, which we'll talk about later. And then issues around bias and discrimination, although this is improving through intentional development by the people who are creating these models. In the beginning, when generative AI text-to-image prompts came out, you could enter a crowd of people into it, and it would give you a crowd of white people because that was the general and average representation on the internet. The presence of at least the internet it was trained on, which is primarily the English language internet, was showing the images that existed in it were mostly white people, mostly pretty white people, and so therefore that's what it would reproduce. And you could only get results that would show folks from multiple races or multiple genders, et cetera, if you asked for those things specifically. Now, it's getting better. So if you enter a crowd of people into most of these engines today, you'll get a much more diverse set of results. So things are improving, but it still has a kind of intentional bias, which also reveals some of our implicit bias, which also reveals some of our implicit bias as a kind of culture and of the internet, as a kind of global culture based on things like colonialism, et cetera. But let's look at some demos of where things have come. First of all, since Stable Diffusion was released 604 days ago, there has been a massive profusion of Gen AI tools. And like I said in the beginning, caveat, there's probably 25 more that have been released just since I started planning this presentation. But our major players here are going to be OpenAI, Midjourney, and Runway, with a side note here for Adobe Firefly and Blockade Labs. Adobe's gotten into this game as the first major player of existing software publishers, and they have some pretty significant contributions to make around intellectual property, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. To give you some sense of what can be created using these tools, I sort of stress tested them and asked them to create images that were not likely to be found on the internet as a whole. So, and this is also going to reveal some both strengths and weaknesses of some of these tools. So in this particular image, I asked DALL-E, which is OpenAI's primary text-to-image tool, to generate a map of the Silk Road using coffee and tea stains. And so I knew that it was something that did not exist on the internet as an actual image, and I wanted to see how it would interpret that set of commands. So you can see you get some vaguely Asia, Africa shaped uh, uh, blobs that are painted clearly in coffee and tea. So there's some real strengths here. It did get close, but it didn't give me a precise map of the Silk Road, nor did it give me something that actually looks like it was truly painted in different shades. So just revealing some weaknesses as well as strengths. But moving on to some of those strengths, or actually moving on to a separate type of weakness, again, to point out the type of pattern recognition that occurs and where you can find the kind of chinks in the armor. So this I asked for an archaeological dig where the artifacts being dug out of the ground were actually the skeletons of people in modern business suits carrying coffee cups. So again, an image I knew that wouldn't exist on the internet. And you can see the interpretation is wildly all over the place. Largely, it has to do with um, uh, uh, pictures of people in modern business suits actually appearing to conduct archaeology, or supervise it, and it also tends to these weird aesthetics of like paintings and models and miniatures. So again, an issue where like there's some really creative stuff here, but it's not really nailing what I actually asked for because it's not truly understanding intellectually the prompt. It's trying to coordinate or to triangulate between available images on the internet, and because I'm asking for something that doesn't really exist, there aren't any. Okay. Some places where it has real power. So this is an image that I drew. This image that says original up in the top center of the screen. That was for a show where I needed hundreds and hundreds of images of doors, and I needed it for a complex animation sequence about housing. And so I drew that original image at the top and then fed it into DALL-E and asked it to recreate variations upon variations. So I was able to create really beautiful looking, aesthetically similar doors, hundreds of them in just a few moments, based on my own work. So no intellectual property considerations, no ethical violations, a really powerful use of DALL-E to amplify my own creativity and make it more efficient, which I think is really interesting and beautiful. Just to give you a closer up look at some of those, this was my drawing, and then you can see it's not perfect recreation of exactly the types of line weights, but it was more than good enough for what I was hoping for, and really gave me some very strong variations. And because doors are something that are so well known, there are very few instances in the stuff that was generated with like the knob at the bottom right corner or the window in the bottom of the door. So it was actually really useful. Some more variations. Midjourney is another text to image generator that came out of the Berkeley University in California. It's a much smaller company and much more dedicated to true research on developing these models. And I really enjoy the aesthetic that it creates. Again, it struggles with that same prompt that I gave the other one about an archaeological dig where the artifacts being dug out of the ground were people in business suits and carrying coffee mugs. There just wasn't enough. It's not doing any better job at interpreting complex prompts that don't have existing references on the internet. But it does create a really beautiful aesthetic. To speak to that, here's a prompt that was a photograph of an Austrian castle floating in the sky above the evergreen trees, only partially visible in the morning mist, with the rising sun coming up to the left and rear of the castle. So this is a set of very specific prompts, a very specific style, and created a really gorgeous image entirely from scratch. And it only suffered in a few places. It actually interpreted floating in the sky as metaphorical, appearing to float in the sky, rather than actually floating in the sky, because it couldn't find a reference image that was showing a photograph of a castle in the sky, or at least not enough of them to kind of triangulate in on that pattern. But gorgeous work, gorgeous imagery. Midjourney has another tool where you can actually use two reference images to combine into a synthesized middle style, which is also really beautiful. So the top image is just a doodle I did on my iPad in Procreate, and then the bottom image, that same image of doors. And I asked it to conflate those two images and create a new image based on both styles combined. And it created this really lovely aesthetic of that's almost like the end credits for Ratatouille, if you've seen that movie. A kind of splashy, painterly, really beautiful work. And I really enjoyed this image, and I ended up actually using this in another sequence in that same show because it was creating something that was a kind of gorgeous style that I don't know that I would have gotten to on my own, but is all based on my own work, things I created from scratch. All right, Adobe Firefly is interesting. I gave it that same prompt about the Austrian castle floating in the sky. And this is where it got to. And beautiful images, not quite as compelling as Midjourney, in my opinion. But the great news about Firefly is that it's all based on Adobe stock image. Like, it wasn't open trained. Open trained is how we refer to Gen AI generators like Midjourney and DALL-E, which were trained on all the images on the internet. It was basically given Google Images as a search tool and said, go wild and train on everything. So it has a very broad set of definitions and patterns that it can repeat. Firefly was only trained on the catalog of Adobe stock images that were already in existence and licensed by Adobe for open use. So in this case, it's got a much smaller pool of images comparatively to train on, but it's still quite sizable enough to do some interesting stuff. And the work that you get from Firefly so far is holding up for licensing. So the stuff you make with Firefly is actually something you can own. And we'll talk about this more at the end of this presentation, but that's actually a really complicated and useful question. They've also started building in a series of really, really powerful AI-powered tools into Adobe Photoshop. So if I was the most evil real estate developer in the world, I could take the top image, which is of Grand Tetons National Park, and turn it into a golf course. And all I had to do to get between top image and bottom image was select to kind of draw a circle around that image of the lake and grass fields in the bottom of the original image, and then at golf course, I just typed into a text prompt and it filled that in immediately with no additional retouching for me. So incredibly powerful ability to alter and use text to just change images entirely with very little professional knowledge or skill needed, which is both, again, good and bad. So here's that original image. All I did was just draw a line around that lake and say golf course. And that's what the resulting image is, again, with no retouching from me. So it creates a really seamless blend of the AI generated content with the background content. Now, does the golf course have a few too many sand traps in the same place? Maybe, but it's still pretty impressive for something that takes about 10 seconds to do. Now we get into video, and I'm going pretty fast through these because there's some sort of larger systemic topics we want to cover at the end. But most recently, just in the last 6 or 8 months, there have been a lot of tools for text-to-image video and video based on reference images. So there's really two primary competitors there. One is Runway ML, which created Gen 1 and Gen 2, which I'll show a video of in just a moment. And the other is Sora, which you've probably heard. Sorry, this is some other of the tools that Runway ML has. So they can do text to video, video to video. They can train video on custom portraits. They can do frame interpolation, which is really useful for slowing things down and doesn't have any of the ethical considerations that some of these other things do. But they have a lot of different tools for using video and images in AI. But the thing you've probably heard about most recently is Sora, which is OpenAI that did DALL-E and ChatGPT. Their venture into the text to video market, and it is kind of mind-blowing and rightfully got a lot of attention from the kind of international news. And I'll show an example of these two things side by side in just a moment. Also out there, just to know where the field is going, this is a product that was released recently, is now in beta, but this is Blockade Labs, their Skybox Studio product, has now created a text to 3D volume generator. So this purely web-based interface allows you to type in a description of a 3D world and then to generate a textured mesh of that world, including background images and baked-in lighting, and then to download that mesh as an editable 3D volume that can be used for the creation of video games, visual effects for film and cinema, for VR experiences, whatever. So we're getting into a place where you're going to be able to use easy to use Gen AI tools to be able to create essentially whatever you want. So we're really cutting down the distance between imagination and reality for people who may not have access or have had the training in creative technologies or creative design work. Now, we'll talk more about what that means for people who are working in the creative fields and how they might be impacted. And I think there's some better news there than maybe you think. But let's go ahead and show, and then Stable Diffusion, which I also want to show an example of, because it has continued to evolve since it was originally released 604 days ago, and now has some really fabulous and customizable patterns, things that Sora and Runway cannot yet achieve, because you can download an instance of Stable Diffusion as opposed to it living just on their servers and train it specifically on a set of images and content that you give it, which is really important if you're thinking about ethical considerations, because it's then trained just on images that you've provided, which allows it to be much more specific, but also to avoid the issue of like you're using a model that is trained on other people's work. So I'm going to show video examples of those four, and then we will come back to the presentation. Let me just switch my share here. So here's Gen 2, and unfortunately I'm not able to share sound from the videos. But this is a kind of track of how this has evolved over time. So Runway originally released Gen 1 about 8 or 9 months ago. And Gen 1 started off as something where you could feed a reference image and a reference video together and generate a new video that combined the styles, kind of like we saw with Midjourney. But you can see the model has significantly improved in output over time. And now they're moving on to a place where they can actually do text to video prompts. This predated Sora by about a month and a half. It just didn't make the international news splash because it didn't have OpenAI's kind of visibility through ChatGPT, et cetera. So these images you're seeing here are entirely generated by the text prompts at the bottom of the screen. And there are clearly some issues like that keep them from being perfectly photorealistic. But for individual creativity, like people exploring new forms of storytelling, they have a distinct style. They're sort of beautiful and interesting. I think there's some real chance for people to be able to translate really imaginative stories and works into images the rest of us can see using this. And I think that's one of the most important things for us to take away from the conversation about generative AI. I'm going to switch to looking at Sora. You can see in Sora's video here is 10 minutes long. I highly encourage you to watch it. But like, so this is an image of, they asked for a cartoon of a dancing kangaroo. Let's see if I can get this to cartoon kangaroo disco dances. So again, that was all that was fed into this. So this is would normally have been probably 100 hours worth of work in creating that character, texturing it, rigging it, lighting it, animating it. And now that has gone to, just moments of work done by the AI model. Again, for good and for ill, right? Golden Retriever puppies. I'm going to go on to some of these others. Just looking at all the different styles. So here's this several giant woolly mammoths. So you can see the level of specificity that can be included here in the model. Historical footage that can be recreated entirely from scratch. Stop motion animation. It's actually really effective. There's lots of stuff for it to train on, etc. Yeah. So incredible possibilities there, and not freely available for use yet. It's still in beta. You have to request access and be granted it. There's limits on how long you can do, but we're only a year, maybe at most, away from an openly available freemium model that allows you to pay for access to generate this kind of thing without just through a web browser. Now, paying for access is, of course, another ethical consideration, because are you then opening access to imagination for just those who can afford a monthly subscription? Yes. So what does that mean in the end? So I talked about Skybox or Blockade Labs 3D generator. This is just a really quick overview of that. These are all 3D worlds. The ability to like sketch in a reference image and to give it a text to create around it. download that, import it into other images, into things like Unreal, Unity, 3D Studio Max, Maya, Blender. Yeah, so you can get a sense of what's possible with that. But for video game creators or aspiring video game creators, that might be one of the most useful tools I've ever seen in terms of reducing time spent on level creation, etc. All right, and then last, I'm actually want to show a work using Stable Diffusion that was done by several of my former students who founded a company called Pseudomagic. This is a work they did for us as part of a residency around Dia de los Muertos, and they actually fed a instance of Stable Diffusion a large number of images of different calaveras and enabled it to create new ones. And essentially, it created this concept of a kind of sugar skull dreams of itself, and made some references to Magritte and otherwise. But you can see the level of specificity here is much more like the level of specificity is higher than you see with the kind of open train generators like Sora and Runway. This is allows you to create very specific and powerful artistic content. Now, the level of computing power necessary to do so is higher because you have to actually run the instance of Stable Diffusion on your own machine. And you also have to be more accomplished at sort of understanding the kind of things that it needs and what the output's going to be useful for in terms of, as what they did, importing into a program called Text Designer and using these particles to kind of form and destroy the image. So a really interesting, beautiful work, truly artistic, off of their own content and truly creating something I think is a reflection on AI and death and dreams in a really interesting way. So really powerful, harder to use, harder to get to, but I think something that is instructive for where the future of the art might go. All right, shifting back to our slides. I'm going to shift over to talk about the intellectual property and ethical considerations here. So I'd like to go to the next poll. Amelia, if you have that pulled up, because I want to know who, based on what you know right now, who owns images or creative content that you create with image gen AI tools? You do, as in the person typing it in and using it, the company that made the AI generator, the creators of the content it was originally trained on, or no one? So take a second, consider your answer just based on what you know right now. Don't Google it. Because trust me, if you Google it, you will get a confusing array of answers. And we'll give people 20, 30 seconds to respond to this. All right. Amelia, I don't know where we're at, but if we have a majority of folks responding, I'd love to see the results of this one.
Sure, we've got about 606.
That's great. Yeah, good. So this is pretty much the distribution I was expecting. So we got about 18% of people saying that they would own the content, 39% saying the company that made the AI, 25% saying the creators of the content it was trained on, and 19% saying no one. Congratulations to those 19% at the end, because you are correct. Actually, as of right now, images or any type of original content created by a generative AI tool cannot be protected under at least US copyright law or patents. It is because AI creations, anything that emerges from a generative AI tool, is public domain, meaning that you can create it using the generators, but then anybody else can take what you've created and use it again. You cannot stop anyone from copying it, using it, etc. The one asterisk to this is except maybe Adobe Firefly created products. As I mentioned earlier, Adobe Firefly was not open trained, but was instead trained specifically on a defined set of products to which Adobe owns the exclusive rights. And so the ability for Adobe then to convey a use specifically of the AI ownership then to the resulting user of Firefly is possible, but has not yet been actually held up by court precedent. So, and of course, for many of you who are not in the US, all of those things may have to be independently decided in the courts of your own country or in the various consortium that exist for the recognition of intellectual property. So some of this, is obviously this is very much in process, but the core here, at least in the US, is that AI cannot be an author or inventor because US constitutional laws require a human to be an author or inventor. And that's actually built on a really funny case. The image that you see on the bottom of the screen here, I'll move myself out of the way, was actually taken by a monkey. It actually grabbed the photographer's camera and took a picture of itself. And there was an animal rights group, because this became very popular, very widely known. It was the photographer earned a lot of money off of this picture as it kind of went viral. And it was challenged by an animal rights advocate that the monkey took the picture. Why isn't the monkey getting the support or seeing the results from it? And ultimately, it was decided that the photographer that owned the camera owned the image because the monkey, as a non-human, wasn't eligible for ownership of that intellectual property. So that has translated to AI in a very unexpected use of precedent. And so now we have lots of different levels of complexity and confusion that will take probably decades to sort out in the courts fully, and may require international treaty eventually to reconcile the work. And somewhere during that period, we may also be debating the personhood of AI. So this could get very complicated very quickly. Another example here, a woman, a man, Van Lindbergh, used a series of Midjourney images to populate a comic, which he had written, and then used Midjourney to generate the images to go with the comic. He also, however, he also altered the images after they were generated by Midjourney. They added layers, drew on top of them, etc. And the Copyright Office decided that he did not own the original images, but owned the alterations. So at least in terms of a whole work, no one could take the entire comic book and sell it to someone else. That he held the copyright on the comic book as a whole, but the source images, the character, he couldn't trademark the character that he created, Zarya, and the images could be altered and used by other people and be repurposed. So it's kind of a weird, hazy middle ground. Some things, some rules, we'll say for now, some guidelines for thinking about how AI created materials are useful to you. AI created materials are not protected by copyright. Others can use it without permission. Human additions, modifications, selections are subject to copyright protection. So if you use AI to generate materials, you should be using either your own materials or making alterations to the materials that are generated, and making sure that you're establishing a kind of frame around it that will give you ownership in some way. Now, some of this stuff may change as court precedent evolves, but for right now, that seems to be the kind of holding place. And at the baseline, what this means is it's really useful to use AI output for ideas or brainstorming to generate things that then you can use as a model for your own content, and to use for internal use, like things where you're going to use it for a creative project while you're in school, depending on what your instructors and universities say about the policy uses in that regard. And then for anytime you're doing kind of nonprofit level communications, you're probably safe to use AI, especially because you're just not worried that it's going to be in the public domain. It's safe for you to use. You're not going to get sued at the moment, and you're also, and you don't really care if somebody else takes that image and does something else with it, as long as you're okay with not sole ownership. And this is why, in responding to a Q&A question in the chat, so little of this is used in truly professional level arts and creativity because you can't guarantee that you'll maintain sole ownership. So do not use AI without human additions if you want exclusive rights. Um, Other ethical concerns, AI sometimes replicates materials within databases. There's a very famous example of AI accidentally, just by the nature of its own pattern recognition, stealing a Taylor Swift song and presenting it to somebody as if it was something that it had generated on its own. Um, if copyrighted materials are within an AI database or whatever the trained volume of instances it has, output of the AI could potentially infringe on those underlying copyrights. That's going to be up to the courts to decide on an individual level whether or not your image that you created was stolen by AI will be based on whether or not a human jury or judge can say, oh, I see that this is something that is irrevocably something that is lifted specifically from this other thing. That's going to get harder and harder to prove as those diffusion models expand. The future, so just to sum up a couple of examples, the future of generative AI is uncertain. With rare exceptions, no one currently knows who owns AI generated content. It's personalized. The really powerful and ethically clear ways of using AI involve using an individual instance to train on your work or your creative output to enable you to create more of it more quickly, to create versions and synthesize things into new formats that you wouldn't have expected, as I showed with some of the work that I've used it for on my own. It's chaotic. Most of the products and systems discussed today have been around for less than a year. In the next 6 months, we'll see another huge explosion of new applications and new models. It's a roller coaster. It's going to be debated for forever, as far as forever goes these days. It's going to open up issues of creative authorship. It's going to open up creative authorship to new people and allow imaginations to be more broadly heard, to open up to new voices. But it's also might atrophy our ability to actually create things with our hands that might have unexpected psychological impact. It might push creativity to new heights, but it also might help us. It might also hurt us in terms of being able to have thoughts that aren't reverting to the common denominator. Because remember, these models are all trained on kind of pattern recognition of existing work. They are fundamentally incapable of creating totally new work. So I'm really interested to see where, for example, the visual arts field takes that in terms of how do they create things that are outside the body of trained work altogether. And ultimately, we're left with this question of how do these technologies and practices affect human connectivity and meaningful storytelling? Are they improving the ability for us to tell stories to each other that are meaningful, or are they just helping us regress to a mean and keeping us from really progressing? That'll be the question of the next few years. Last thing, just to point out, there is no consensus about these things. These are two articles that have occurred side by side in a Google review and a Google search. How generative AI can augment human creativity and how AI could disrupt creative work. Now, those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but you can see those are two from the same publication within 3 months of each other that have totally different takes. And finally, I asked ChatGPT to what would be the positive and negative impacts of generative AI, because I figured if you're going to have an opinion about something, you might as well ask the thing itself. So I asked ChatGPT to predict what generative AI would have in terms of positive and negative impacts on society. I won't read all these out loud because I'd like to conclude for questions and so on. But you see the positive things, much of which we've talked about, some of which were in unrelated fields, and the negative impacts: job displacement, bias and discrimination, privacy concerns, the things we've discussed. I promise I came up with those before I asked ChatGPT. But that's it for me. Thank you for attending today. Really happy to see the engagement in Q&A. We'll get to some of those questions, and feel free to reach out to me if you have further questions or inquiries.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jacob. I will move on to asking some of the questions here in the Q&A on behalf of the audience. So the first question is, in the in the case of artificial intelligence, in the case of creating imaginary sceneries, does it have limits? If I say create a scenery of 300 years ago, would it be possible?
Yes, absolutely. Now, in certain areas, what is possible is limited by what reference images exist. So if you asked it to create a photograph of 300 years ago, before photography was invented, it's most likely to create something that is either including things that are anachronistic, as in things that were inappropriate to that time period, or it will create something that's much more in the style of a painting or a model, because those things do exist. Paintings of 300 years ago were obviously very common. So like there are some limitations, but yes, you can create images of time before things existed. Whatever is out on the internet can be recreated in new formats by Gen AI.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Moving on to the next question. An audience member asks, would you agree that if you pay for the service of generative AI and then the rights should be yours? Because it is not different from a person paying a designer to make him a logo and then own it. The designer uses other content that he has seen to inspire himself and make the logo, just as AI uses other content to create something new.
So that's a really complicated question, which I covered some of. I would say the answer, of course, is it depends. If you're using a service or a Gen AI model like Adobe Firefly as an end user, and you are paying for that subscription because Adobe Firefly is a paid subscription model, and only been trained on images to which the Adobe has the rights, and they're willing to convey them to you as part of that transaction, then I would say that'll probably hold up, at least so right now. And in general, I would say I agree with your statement myself. This is not going to hold up in court. That you are probably right most of the time, except in those cases where the generative AI model has been trained on other artists' work, and therefore replicating or reproducing another artist's work in a way that's visible and understandable. Now, there's some discussions there about like essentially human beings also work the same way. We train on the images that we see every day. We learned in many cases in arts classes to reproduce the work of the masters before we go on to have our own work. Is that the same thing? In some ways, yes. In some ways, we are pattern recognition machines. But there's a fundamental difference, at least legally at this point. So at this point, if you want to be safe, or at least as close to safe as you can get, you'll use a service like Adobe Fireflies, which has a specific set of licenses that have been created around both the trained content and the conveying of that license to you as the end user.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Moving on to the next question here. Open generative AI are trained by images, which are in Google. So the results are based on these images. Do the generated images by Gen AI go back to the Google engine? This would mean that the real pics get mixed up with AI generated pictures, correct?
100%. And this is a really interesting level of debate for people who are thinking about the future of what Gen AI can lead to in terms of particularly aesthetics. Um, Not every image that's generated by an image Gen AI generator ends up back in Google. It would require a human to download that image and then upload it to the internet somewhere where the Google crawler can find it and index it. However, a lot of that obviously does, because people generate images because they want to use them. So you create your new D&D character in Midjourney. It creates another instance in the world of a female elf holding a sword, and puts that you upload that onto an internet site that is about your game. Google's crawler finds it. Therefore, OpenAI's DALL-E 2 model that you used to generate it in the first place finds it, and so it's essentially creating a feedback loop where we might. And there's some really interesting potential ramifications of that, of diversion from truly human aesthetics, as in the model itself starts to have an effect on how we perceive certain types and styles and artistic interpretations and so on. And at some point, there's been some theorization that AI will essentially be creating that a new type of art of its own, that it would not be possible with purely human intervention. So that's a really interesting question, but there isn't really a definite answer, except for, yes, many of them make it back into that kind of feedback loop.
Thank you so much. Moving on to our next question. Member of the audience asks, You've implied a few times that the models look up reference images and make a collage. My understanding is that they can grasp concepts and apply them to make entirely new images. Um, but still, they're bound to existing statistical distributions. Can you clarify this?
On some level, this is beyond my level of expertise as a practitioner. But what I can tell you is that the patterns and concepts are emergent from the data in most cases. Some of the generators have been tweaked intentionally by the programmers, as I was mentioning earlier, in one case to avoid implicit bias, to understand and refer to specific concepts and certain types of images. But for the most part, the concepts are actually patterns derived from the trained pool, as opposed to things that are actually being grasped. They are emergent patterns in the data rather than something that the generators have been programmed specifically to understand in most cases. Now, there are certain things about faces and human biology in particular. When AI and Gen AI first started, there was this there was a kind of joke going around that if you wanted to tell an AI image, you look for the eighth finger, because like the hands were all screwed up most of the time and the faces were misaligned. That's gotten better with time, and that's partially because there's been intentional work by the programmers of those models in order to create and recognize certain concepts. But most of in terms of applications, most of it is emerging from the patterns themselves, which is why, for example, when I showed the map of the Silk Road created by coffee and tea stains, or the archaeological dig finding modern people in business suits and coffee cups, it couldn't grasp those concepts in the same way, because there was no example out there on the internet. Like, you couldn't grasp the concept of this object in this location because there was no existing example. And those are oddball examples, but that's exactly what I was trying to achieve, is finding the kind of gaps in the model.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your answer. The next member of the audience asks, you mentioned an international treaty would be needed in order to establish rules related to IP. Can you please explain it briefly? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and this is again outside my area of expertise. I'm not a lawyer, and my expertise is not in international law regarding intellectual property. But I know from just kind of general professional awareness that there are consortiums of countries that have agreed together to mutually recognize each other's copyright and patent protections, and not all countries are part of those. And in the long run, I think, because of the individual, like, unique global availability of generators, we're probably going to need an international treaty that may or may not include the entire world, that is going to mutually recognize a particular policy about intellectual property ownership from Gen AI materials. That's a what we call a semi-pro prediction. But again, if for real answer, you want to refer to a specialty in international relations and intellectual property law.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next member of the audience asks a few questions inside one. It's a bit complex, so I will do my best to summarize this. As we continue to explore the capabilities of artificial intelligence, a key question arises. How will AI shape the future of creativity? Will AI be able to develop its own sense of creativity, creating without guidance or understanding of what is beautiful? Or will it remain a tool to augment human creativity, aiding in the generation of new ideas, but potentially also distracting us from more creative activities?
That's an easy question to answer. No idea. No idea. And isn't that fun? Those are the fundamental questions of where we're at right now, and no one knows the answer to them definitively. If I had to guess, I would say it'll be somewhere in the middle. There's obviously, it's going to shape the future of creativity, and somewhere we will make decisions about policy and implementation, and the market to some degree will speak about how useful and attractive we find AI generated content and how much we reject it because of its regression to the mean. But I have no idea what the answers will be. I think most likely we will see an improvement in the augmentation of human creativity, and we will probably see an aesthetic movement that is based on AI as an intentional style, as kind of an adoption of kind of a sense of the future. But beyond those two things, I have no idea where it'll go, and neither does anyone else.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Um, so next question. Um, from a participant, if I make an essay with AI support, should I cite it from the AI website?
That depends on the policies of your either individual field in this journals of record or the university. So right now, currently at ASU, you are required to cite when you've used AI materials in the writing of a paper or the creation of a piece of art, and those things are allowed, provided that you cite and tell the whoever's reading it and the audience that what you used it for. So you cite that you used ChatGPT and you say exactly how you used it. That is currently allowed. That is not a widely accepted necessarily thing among all fields. So if you're writing a PhD dissertation or something that's going to exist in the world outside of your university, at least is going to be findable online, it may not be a good idea to use AI tools at the moment, at least in terms of generating the final content. Using it for brainstorming, using it for synthesizing large data sets, that's all great. It's essentially just doing the job of a really powerful search engine. But in terms of generating the final content, probably not such a great idea at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Um, where do you see Gen AI heading in the next 5 years beyond its use for creating images, videos, and texts?
I mean, it's a really good question. My expertise is in images and video, and I've talked a little bit about what I think is going to happen from here. Much more powerful and shorter distances between imagination and result. That is actually what you're hoping to achieve. Um, in the application of it to other fields, there's great information out there, which I will not insult you by trying to replicate here, because it's outside my area of expertise. But if you're particularly in like pharmaceuticals, the use of Gen AI and pattern recognition, informed by things like the proteomics projects and genomics projects, and they may enable very personalized medicine, because massive pattern recognition from large data sets is exactly what AI does well. So the ability to create specific drugs that are targeted to individual variations of cancers, individual types of humans, like people who have, like men, women, other races, etc., even age, are possible, and we're still way away from those. The issue there is capitalism, because all that stuff has huge amounts of potential, but right now, the products of anything created by AI would not be owned by the companies that would want to then market those drugs. So we have to resolve that before we will see massive available products in most industries that are driven in our world, unfortunately, by profit.
Well, thank you so very much, Jacob. That is actually all the questions we have time for today. We could stay forever asking all these questions, but
Yeah.
I tried to cover most of what we could cover. Um, Everybody, if you will please stay on for one moment. I would just like to remind you that we give badges to those who participated. So, one of the things we've done this year is provide these badges, and they can be put on your social media to show your participation in the masterclass. If you registered with your home university email, you will receive one of these badges electronically in the next few days. I know many students are also watching this masterclass with their professors in a classroom, so your professor will take your attendance, and as soon as we get that information from your professor, you will also receive one of these badges. If you have any questions about the badges or you did not receive one, please email asusupport@centana.com, as you see here on the screen, or the WhatsApp number below. Before you all go, I would like to talk about the next masterclass in May. Our presenter in May is the director of ASU's Milo Institute, which focuses on industries related to outer space. He will be talking about how the growing space industry impacts different aspects of our economy and life on Earth. You will be surprised to learn how much of an impact space has on our lives and economies in 2024. Look for the QR code to register for in your school's social media. You won't want to miss another great masterclass. Thank you again for coming to the ASU Masterclass, and thank you once again, Professor Pinholster, for your time and thoughtful lecture. I look forward to welcoming you back to the next ASU Masterclass in May. Until then, take care, and I'll see you back here next month.